shape the future. The generation that fought for India's independence gifted us political freedom. The generation of today has been entrusted with
Just a second. There must be a technical issue. Kindly bear with us. Our anchor will be right back. She's in amidst a technical issue. Thank you.
Sorry, that was a technical glitch. The generation of today has been entrusted with a different mission to build a Vikasita Bharat, a confident Bharat, a compassionate Bharat, and a Bharat respected across the world. Young minds possesses energy, education gives direction, values provide purpose. When all the three comes together, a nation progresses. Today's topic, social reforms during the freedom movement, reminds us that India's freedom struggle was not fought only on the streets of legislature. It was equally fought in schools, villages, homes, and communities. Visionaries like Raja Ram Mohan Rai, Swami Vivekananda, Savitribai Phule, Mahatma Jyoti Phule, Swami Dayananda Saraswati, Sri Narayana Guru, and many others believed that political freedom would remain incomplete unless society itself became enlightened, educated, and united. Their reforms awakened confidence. Their ideas transformed society. And transformed society ultimately transformed the nation. Friends, it gives me immense pleasure to introduce today's distinguished speaker, Sri Rajath Sethi. Rajath ji is an author, public policy thinker, and an advisor to Honorable Chief Minister. Through his work in governance, public policy, and nation building, he has demonstrated that meaningful leadership is not determined by age, but by vision, competence, and commitment to society. In today's world, where many young people aspire to make difference, Rajath ji stands as an inspiring example of what purpose-driven leadership can achieve. His journey itself is a message to India's youth that when knowledge is guided by character and purpose, age is never a barrier to nation building. At a time when Bharat has the world's largest youth population, we need role models who inspire young minds to channel their education, talent, and energy towards innovation, public service, and the development of our nation. Rajath ji represents that spirit. We are honored to have him with us this evening to speak on the important theme, social reforms during the freedom movement. Rajath ji, on behalf of Disha Bharat, the Mythic Society, and all our viewers joining us from across Bharat and around the world, I extend my warm welcome to you. Welcome you, Rajath. So, Rajath, the virtual platform is yours now.
Dhanyavad Chetana ji, and namaskar to all the audience and the members of Disha Bharat. It is a profound honor to be amongst all of you. It's been a couple of years, or actually more, since I last spoke on Disha Bharat, and this series which the leadership team of Disha Bharat has conceptualized over the years. In the run-up to the Independence Day, we have these 15 lecture series which talks about various aspects of our independence movement, and it helps us rekindle some of the old memories, understand what were some of the national questions before us during those times, and how did we address those questions. Therefore, each topic is quite distinct, very interesting, very enriching, And therefore, it gives us a moment to pause and think about some of those greater questions that our nation's forefathers and foremothers thought about, debated about, and came to certain conclusions, which helped us shape ourselves as a nation all along these several decades. Therefore, it's a distinct honor to speak on the topic of social reforms that shaped alongside our freedom movement. What were some of those contradictions? How did this social reform movement got influenced? What were some of the historic collisions between various strands and themes that were being debated around that time? And how did we reach to certain critical milestones in our reform journey? Therefore, I'll start off by recounting certain things. But let me tell you, I don't want it to be a simple general knowledge based questions as to just listing out all the leaders, social reform leaders, and what all they did. All of that is amply available on the internet, and all of you are really well aware of general knowledge questions around these specific reforms and who led those reforms. But my question is that I'm going to touch upon today is deeper and quite distinct from just the names of movements and names of individuals who led. The question that I'm going to discuss upon today over the next 30 minutes is, what was it that during the 200 years of colonial colonial rule, so much of social reforms started coalescing together? What were some of those underlying forces which were all acting either in unison or distinct from each other, which allowed the society, it captivated the society's imagination and forced them to think around these core issues? See, reform has been a persistent journey of our core civilization for good part of 2 millennia. So right from the Buddhist movement all the way to the Bhakti movement, which spans somewhere around 1600 years, I believe purification, you can call it getting rid of certain dogma, you can call it some certain ill practices being called into question. So this reform exercise has been a long stretched out exercise over a period of 1600 years prior to the British coming in. So we should not assume that it is primarily because of the Western influence or the Renaissance led Westerners coming in and descending on our civilization and telling us that we need to reform, and then suddenly we woke up to these reforms. We were grappling, we were going through some of our own internal questions and answers. We were arguing around some of our practices, and we were going back to the religious text, looking for answers, coming back again, arguing. All of these movements have been going on, especially during the Bhakti movement, when led by Sant Tukaram, Kabir, Guru Nanak Ji, Mirabai, Tulsidas. So all of these people in North India, even in South India, that way, the Nayanars, for example, the Basavana in Karnataka, were also asking similar questions. So it is not about that India and Indian civilization was waiting for the foreigners to come in and say that, hey, you have social issues and social inequalities and you need to address that. We were trying to do what we had to do, but there was something which accelerated the pace of reforms over the last two centuries. So in the 19th and in the early 20th century, it created an unusual historical collision of multiple strains coming together. On one side, we were all facing colonial domination, and the older Indian traditions of critiquing, arguing, was all mixed up together with newer technologies. There were new communication. Newspaper had come in for the very first time. There was a capitalist transformation. The way society was organized economically also underwent through sudden changes. There were emerging rights around emerging ideas around individual rights, and also around the same time, a new arena or a public sphere or a public square was created. While everybody was meeting together on these public squares, asking for freedom, political freedom, when you were all coming together on that same sphere, it asked certain uncomfortable questions which were not asked, and those social structures were not there in which people from all castes, all communities, all genders could all coalesce together and fight for a common end goal. Therefore, these new technological structures, new public sphere that was created, new momentum because of the national movement that was created, also simultaneously created a degree of high urgency and certain contradictions in what we were asking when we were asking for political freedom. So the twin questions were that yes, we are asking for political freedom, but are we socially also free? And are we capable of self ruling and ruling ourselves given all the social inequality that is there? So all these contradictions started getting surface, and this is where interesting dynamics started playing. And this is the reason why there was this acceleration on reforms around that time. So I'm just going to start off with certain pinpointing some deeper intellectual questions around these reforms. So I distinctly tell you the paradox. So colonialism and the colonial and the British rule was producing some kinds of domination and instruments of dominating the indigenous people of our country, and colonial as well as the indigenous, both these strands were seen as operational aspects or dimensions simultaneously. So the reforms that were coinciding with the British rule, it also partly it was because of the colonialism, and the public square that was created started creating deliberations around topics which are much more vocal and much more in the face, like sati, caste exclusion, child marriage, widow and widow rights, gender inequality. All of these things started getting questioned, not because, again, because the Europeans had arrived, but because these questions were getting more asked and more potent because of this common infrastructure of argument that was put into place. Um, so there were also certain questions which were asked around morality, and certain morality was sought from within our scriptures. A lot of the reformers sought that can morality be defended from within, or it requires a self consciousness or a clarity on civilizational values which will have to course correct ourselves, and therefore the answers were not necessarily in the religious scriptures. Therefore, for example, Raja Ram Mohan Roy asked, is sati itself morally defensible? Therefore, the other question is also that how does this practice, what does it say about the India's core civilizational values? And how should India be judged? Because it was that time when globalization forces had also started kicking in, and Indians were being seen from the European lenses. And Indians were being judged around some of these practices, which created a degree of insecurity within us as well. So, therefore, this colonial gaze and the Western gaze further expedited and accelerated some of these questions. So, while these moral prisms were being put onto us, there was a counter pushback from the Indian reformers who were also nationalist. They used to come out with the argument that you have misunderstood our civilization. Our civilization does not justify practices like sati, and these are distortions which have been brought in by vested interest over a period of time. Therefore, these practices are largely corruptions of our tradition, and not the core essence or the core values of what we stand for. So this is what was going on, and then certain fascinating things happened when railways was introduced. So while in the West, when Renaissance was happening and communism started taking shape because of the factory floor, India's factory floor came in, but came in more from an colonial oppression rather than as a common platform for economic upward mobility. But railways played a very interesting and a potent role by giving a common platform wherein all of these debates and discussions started getting much more vocal. Um, and some of the questions that were brought in the profound contradiction that started first with the colonial liberalism itself. So what did the British stand for? They were like, see, British civilization is superior. We've gone through the movements of Renaissance and brought in new liberal ideas like rule of law, liberty, rationality, There is equality before law, there is modern education, and there are constitutional values. These were certain value systems which were, espoused by the British, saying that we are morally superior because this is what we stand for. But there were internal contradictions between all of these values that they were talking. And what were these internal contradictions? So one of the fundamental thing was that if liberty is so universally valuable and a core tenet of British value system, why are Indians denied liberty? When these questions started coming in, these became the great ideological problems for the colonial rulers as well. So while on one side they were talking about John Locke and Mill and liberal political order and all of that, these tools, these values became important aspects of fighting and waging an intellectual war against the empire itself. And Dadabhai Naroji and bunch of others, political reformers, again picked up these issues and challenged the empire. But while it was happening, there were other questions uh, when women started asking, when the Dalits started asking similar questions. So, on one side, a nationalist, an Indian nationalist who were fighting the freedom battle, they used to say that no human being is inherently superior to another. Therefore, the British have no moral right to rule over us. Then, when the baton is passed on to a Dalit, the Dalit asks a similar question. If that principle is true, why can I not drink from the same well? And when a woman asks that similar question, that why does political liberty alone stop at the door of my household? Why do not I have equality within my household also? Similarly, a worker, that why should the freedom should only be replacing British capitalist and not the Indian one? So you can imagine that these contradictions that were there, which became the vocabulary of our freedom struggle, started also in a way asking internal questions in ways in which our society was organized. And therefore, equality and these liberal values are genies. If they come out of the bottle, it is difficult to contain. So this back and forth that started happening gave emergence to leaders like Phule and Ambedkar and bunch of others who use these very principles to start questioning some of these internal practices and called for heavy reforms. Certain others like Periyar took it to the other extreme. They started from a very nihilist and an extremist position that everything that was Hinduism is fundamentally flawed and wrong, which was, of course, the other extreme. But one thing that was largely underlined around the 1920s and the 30s was that national freedom without sufficient radical social freedom is incomplete project. If a society deserves to be free, we need to be socially free as well. So this is the broad theme around which it was happening. Around the same time in 1970, I think it was Sarojini Naidu who led a women delegation before the Chelmsford Reform Commission, saying that even women want suffrage. They want voting rights as well. By the way, this is 1917. It was only in 1920 when the American women got universal adult suffrage. So our women were in sync with the global demands as well. And they were asking for rightful position, rightful voting rights, rightful political participation way before than what rest of the countries were envisaging and were fighting for. Again, an important point, but again, something which came about because colonial values started being used as an instrument by our own nationalists, therefore forcing some of these questions on our own society, acting as a mirror. Second thing that happened was that colonialism and the colonial rule of the British, they also started transforming caste to some extent. They were not abolishing it, but they were hardening it and crystallizing it in some ways. It is very important to understand. What happened in colonial rule was census, caste census. These kind of things started happening. There was enumeration. Social identities were called out and were hardened. Therefore, all these administrative categories that were there, some of the recruitment policies that were brought out, even certain legal rights and classifications that were brought out, started hardening some of these caste identities much more in black and white, in documented identities as well. So, while on one side, the Indian nationalists and led by Mahatma Gandhi and Ambedkar were trying to do away with these distinctions, but certain colonial practices started reinforcing these and institutionalizing some of these caste practices, and made it as a political weapon and as a tool to further sow division within our Hindu society. So, had the Britishers not been there, we were grappling with these issues. We would have grappled this the way the Bhakti movement and some of these names that I took were already beginning to question very seriously some of our caste related problems. But Britishers weaponized those, created such distinct identities that the famous Pune Act and the conversations between Mahatma Gandhi and Baba Sahib Ambedkar uh, were so profound and so deep in conversation, wherein one talked about a clear division in the and autonomy within the Hindu society, and Gandhiji always urged that this is going to permanently divide the Hindu society, and we should not go in for separate electorate. Again, very deep and meaningful conversation. So clearly, British did not invent caste, but they were participants in ossification and crystallization of certain caste identities simultaneously while they publicly denounced caste. Um, also, I was talking about some of these modern communication tools. They converted all of these small injustices that were spread out, littered across the length and breadth of our country into political questions. How did this pan out? So, what is happening in a school if women are not allowed school education? That got published into newspaper. People were organized around these common causes. Petitions were moved. Public controversy was created. Therefore, thereafter, legislations were brought in. So, any movement without these communication tools would have stayed in those respective schools and respective geographies, suddenly had the whole country's attention, and accelerated some of the pace of these reforms that were being talked about. Another thing that I was telling about the economic change, and I touched upon, how railways was so profound in asserting some of the reform measures. Um, Clearly, railways, to some extent, there was a rapid urbanization also. Agriculture was more structured, and the way our indigo farmers to a bunch of other cotton farmers and all of these farmers were organized around commercial interest. New industries, new mills were being set up. There was migration of labor for the first time. By the way, migration didn't was not something that we were used to, but now suddenly we started seeing migration of labor from the rural areas to the urban areas, again accelerating some of these reforms. New professions were created. Bureaucracy was introduced by the British, and therefore new and modern education all coalescing together. So someone could be a member of a specific caste, would be traveling in a railway, or could also be a railway employee. He could also be reading a newspaper in the railways while he was traveling. He was also a voter. He could also be a trade union member, and the same member could also be a nationalist fighting for India's freedom. So understand and imagine this nationalist individual, the kind of a web of contradictions that were there in the mind. And this is why the expressions of his used to change given what platform he or she was on. And this is the reason why I want to tell you that this architecture of chaos, or the architecture of contradictions that were in the mind, this disrupted some of our inherited systems and inherited hierarchies, and called into questions lot of assumptions that we had, and did it in a very fast manner. Um, so if I were to touch upon more, see, there is one more thing. There is a misconception among a lot of leftist readers of Indian history. They say that reforms were brought in because we were westernized, we were getting westernized. But I don't think some of our principal reformers were leftist or were drawn in by Marxist ideas floating around. Pick anybody for that matter. Even Raja Ram Mohan Roy, I mean, I don't think Marx was there during his time, but Swami Vivekanand, Jyotiba Phule, Mahatma Gandhi, even Tagore for that matter, Baba Sahib Ambedkar, and even to the extent of Periyar, I don't think they were influenced by the Western thinkers alone. They were they were intellectual in their own right. There were certain overlapping ideas, but you cannot say that these reformers were influenced by Western ideas and they brought in those Western ideas and fastly tried to reform the society. We were reforming in our own unique Indian way and Indian approach. For example, Mahatma Gandhi, he drew in Gita. Gita was his source of inspiration to bring about some of the course corrections in the society. He picked up Tolstoy, ideas of Ruskin, and even his experiences in South Africa, which were very diverse, and tried to draw certain solutions out of it. Swami Vivekananda used Vedanta. And he was trying to ask for universal human dignity and those ideas, which seemingly are very Western, but they were deeply rooted as well. So, Western modernity to some extent was imported, but the reformist ideas and the leaders of our reform movement were not Western in their thought process at all. So I would not go to the extent of giving a lot of credit to colonial state itself or the British rule itself. If British rule was inherently socially progressive, we would have expected them to constantly attack caste and patriarchy and hierarchy and those kind of things that were existent. It did not. It was cautious about this. They wanted to rule our society. So they wanted to utilize some of these cleavages in our society to their advantage. So I don't think they had any sort of grand plan or a positive agenda during these times. Right from 1857, what all they did in our religious and social customs was used primarily to serve the interest of the empire. But I think the deeper philosophical question always remains that the our social reforms quite the maximum number of social reforms coincided with the colonial rule, no doubt about it. It was accelerated by certain technological inputs which was brought into our society at that time. It was not Western ideas which reformed us. Any reform, we are an argumentative society. Any reform which was imported from outside would not have gotten credence in our society. We would have debated it out. We wanted more deeper philosophical rationale behind it. This is the reason why all our reformers, barring a few, had to always go back to our scriptures and our leading texts to guide us and tell us that okay, this is how you can philosophically interpret what our religious texts are saying and what our spiritual texts are saying constantly. So I think if certain questions, if I were to ask before you, and I'm happy to discuss it more deeply and more openly. Uh, why did the Muslim society not reform itself the pace with which the Hindu society reformed? I mean, we had to wait all the way till 2020, 2020s for certain bad practices like triple talaq to be abolished. Parda system remained so much in practice, and very little could be done to remove those practices. Even in Hindu society, for instance, in certain areas, it is still not there, not removed completely. So one of the principal reasons what academicians have figured out is that political preservation of a community, especially when they had those minority anxieties in place, no amount of reform or reform based argumentation could work. So while a few individual reformers tried to reform the Muslim community also, the pace of reforms in Muslim community was not at all in sync with the other religious communities in our country. And the principal reason was that A, the anxiety of minority and minorities' political rights was cultivated by the Britishers. They they dwelled upon these anxieties to an extent that any kind of a reform measure was seen as a direct attack on the religious practices. So, had it been a homogeneous Muslim society, perhaps we could have still seen more reforms, the way the other homogeneous Muslim societies were reformed to some extent, but not in India. Every question was seen, the reaction was very defensive in nature. Um, these are some of the well documented things. Though reform happened, but it did not seep down into the society to that extent. Similarly, a very important question, because I've worked in the Northeast so extensively, is that what was the character of social reforms in the Northeast? So while Assam was to a great extent in sync with the larger Hindu civilizational values because of various prominent temples like Ma Kamakhya's temple, Prag Jyotishpur being an old empire with a lot of roots in our civilization, that Swami Shankardev's legacy, the Vaishnav traditions which were brought in right at the time when Bhakti movement was going on, preserved some of the legacy values and also brought in certain reforms around caste and caste related identity. So it was done in a very syncretic manner. But in other peripheral regions like Nagaland, Manipur, Mizoram, Meghalaya, all of these states was heavily influenced by the American Baptist. American Baptists struggled a lot with the Kolkata-based Catholics to find way and find some footing, some political footing in the Northeast. But once they did, they brought in a lot of Baptist-related reform ideas, which became a political constituency on its own right. A lot of the reforms that were being talked about in the Northeast, in extreme areas of the Northeast, far-flung areas of Nagaland and Meghalaya and Mizoram, essentially had the value system of governed by the Baptist Church. While it stopped certain bad practices like villages fighting between each other, headhunting practices, those were put to a stop. But there was gravitation of these regions of our country away from the core civilizational values. This was a problem. Currently, there is a massive project which we are all part of, where we want to ensure that Northeast remains a civilizational integral part of our country. But alongside this, there were certain very interesting reactions to the church and the efforts of church, with individuals like Rani Gaindelu, who came out and questioned the practices of the Zeliarong Nagas. She started something which is called Hiraka movement, for instance, wherein she was like, she in fact motivated her community members that we need to go back to our cultural regeneration, our tribal ways. Let's not fall directly into the orbit of what the American Baptist Church is saying. And this was increasingly getting ground. There was a lot of support that she started getting from the Zeliorong community, but eventually we saw that church and the insurgency movement thereafter muzzled the voice of reformers like Rani Gaindelu, who stood up against a lot of odds, and stood up against against the Christian domination of our regions. So, largely, this is what the overall story is of our reforms. I deliberately did not go into what was women-related reforms, specifically caste-related reforms, because you can study all of that. But I just wanted to critique that bunch of these printing presses, newspapers, pamphlets, schools, some of these new universities, again, largely Western domination, Western value system dominated universities, which were brought about. But alongside that, several voluntary professional associations, social associations, when our legislatures got elected into bodies of representation, there, our drafting committee of our constitution, all of these became small stages where every aspect of our society was debated. There was healthy debates. At times it was, in certain cases, acrimonious, but the larger outside enemy, which was the British rule, kept us together, kept an environment where we were able to healthily debate, identify the differences in our worldviews, and resolve those differences in the larger crucible, in especially when we had an external enemy. The challenge now is, how do you carry on the social reform movement that was initiated by our forefathers and foremothers, and keep reform is a permanent feature. Any society around the world has to have a window where fresh air can keep circulating, new ideas keep coming in. The way economics or economic opportunities organizes us goes through vast changes all the time. We have come out with certain ways in order to address inequalities, which is reservation. But it was only good when we had government jobs. In the world of AI and the technological massive disruptions that are coming our way, there will be no government jobs. How would you envisage social equality to continue as a reform project, even into the next generations? How do you facilitate that? Those are some of the deeper questions which we contemporary thinkers will have to think about, so that we can sustain our civilizational values, and preserve some of the things that we hold very dearly into the years and decades that are before us, as we go up to 2047, the 100 years of our political freedom. Thank you. Namaskar.
Thank you, Rajatji. That was a very insightful and inspiring lecture. So, friends, a meaningful lecture does not end with listening. It begins with reflection, and reflection grows through thoughtful questions. Now we shall move into the question and answer session. So, Rajatji, your explanation of colonialism reminds us that history shapes not only nations but also the way generations think. That brings me to a question that many young people may have.
Sure.
So, what I feel is colonialism often weakened confidence in our own knowledge systems, languages, and traditions. How can today's youth rediscover India's intellectual and cultural heritage without isolating themselves from the modern world? Am I audible?
Well, I think Western. So during the time when we were not independent, we were still under the colonial rule. That was a time when we were underconfident of our value system, map of and multiple aspects of it. We were caricatured. We were called snake charmers. We were called the land where women have to burn themselves. There is no right and respect for women in general. All of those labels were put in place. But then our ancestors did not fall into the trap of the Marxist ideas or the ideas that the Western liberalism was espousing. We understood that all the Western ideas is only coming when they are sitting in a luxury of social monoliths. They did not have to go through the struggle of contradicting social identities, multiple religious groups sitting within the country. Look at what happened to the Western liberalism now, when a small set of migrants going in from Muslim countries and going to countries which were the torch bearers of Western liberal ideas, like Sweden, how did the country react? So we, and I think our ancestors realized that some of these Western ideas were largely academic, but when push comes to shove, all these ideals would be thrown out of the window by the same people who are espousing it. And that very same thing is happening right before our eyes now. Therefore, we have our unique Indian way, a unique civilizational way, which has condensed and crystallized over millennia and millennia. We therefore have to be confident that there are these deeper layers which has taught us how to coexist together and address the inequality questions and certain reform questions that will constantly be put before us. But we can do it. We've done it in the past, and we can do it in a very healthy manner without falling for external ideals and external value systems, because those value systems have not been stress tested. They haven't gone through some of the questions and the challenges that we as a society have gone through. Therefore, any cut, copy, paste ideal is a complete fatal approach. Therefore, we should be confident in what we stand for. If our young friends have issues about understanding, read about our civilizational values. What do we as a nation being, what do we stand for? What are our fundamental tenets? How over all these millennia have we stood our ground and stood our philosophical and civilizational ground when we were constantly being invaded. External value systems were being thrusted upon us, but we did not fall for all of these lures. And a very easy exit could have been that we would have followed their religious practices, followed their ideological practices, and just became one with them. But we deliberately kept our thinking intact, because we at the bottom of it, and the scriptures that we have, and the spiritual bent of mind that we have, the argumentative bent of mind that we have, and the path to salvation that we have individually crafted out over these several millennia is so unique, is so rich, that we don't have to externally go for looking for answers. Therefore, reading is what will give us more confidence. And I believe in the day of AI and all of that, reading is disappearing from our younger audiences. The more you read, the more you will understand that some of the value system that we hold so dear and we are so proud of what are the core tenets of those, and why does it stand test of time?
Yeah, I agree 100% with you, Rajati. So you explained that the freedom movement was not only political struggle, but also a movement for social reform. So in today's India, where should social reform begin? With governments, institutions, or with each one of us as individuals? What is your opinion on this?
Okay, so we need to understand what are the social problems that are facing us today. Um, so, of course, there is still caste-related inequalities that is there. There are still economic opportunities which can create a level playing field that are still not there, that are still dominated with certain castes. Over a period of time, we have gotten so used to one singular solution, which is reservations in jobs, that we believe that is the end all and be all of all social reforms in our society. Maybe that is not everything. While I don't contest the question of reservation at all, that should continue. But the ways in which our economies are going to organize us in the coming days and years, that calls into question that the opportunities that reservation provided are no longer there. Therefore, what could be the other ways in which you can allow some of the communities which feel unequal to rise up the social ladder along with the economic ladder? Therefore, it's open. How do you bring in uh, uh, bring in opportunities at such scale that some of these questions can become moot in their own right? Right now, the size of the pie is very limited, and we are busy dividing the pie in ways in which equal opportunity can be given to all social communities. But we have rarely thought about, is the size of the pie shrinking or is it increasing in size? My problem is that if you look at it from a limited prism of government jobs, it is shrinking. Therefore, this anxiety among the youth that we see keep on spilling over on the streets, it is because they are seeing it from a very straight-jacketed manner. We should start thinking that how many entrepreneurs are coming from the Dalit communities, for example. How do we press the accelerator on those things so that our Dalit entrepreneurs can be celebrated in our society? Perhaps that is something wherein why should we always see that we have a my bap state which has to provide an economic opportunity for the social emancipation of the Dalit community? Why should that be a singular frame? Why can a confident Dalit entrepreneur not rise up, not have access to capital, is able to hire people and can create opportunities not just for his own community, but communities across the social strata? I envisage that as a core approach in which we have to rethink how we have tried to do redistributive justice on social lines.
Okay, when we are talking about reforming society. So many reformers believe that meaningful progress comes from reforming society by preserving its civilizational values, what you have discussed, right? So how can today's youth embrace modernity without losing their connection with Bharat's culture, traditions, and heritage? What is your
Yeah, no, this is very interesting, and this is what I wanted to bring about. That, throughout the independence movement, all the reforms that were being done, on one side there was reform, and simultaneously on the other side there was mirror image and cultural revival also. So while these might just sound they are poles apart and completely opposite, but they coexisted. This is why the reform movement over the last 2 centuries is just so rich and so intellectually deep, that simple answers like how did cultural revivalism or religious revivalism go in sync with these reforms? And I think you pick up any example, Brahma Samaj, Arya Samaj, um, there were Pratana Samaj as well. All of these movements were going on which did not shun our cultural values. It in fact revived them and strengthened them. Therefore, our approach has it has always been to look for being stand for as a society, what are our core values and how do we bring reforms in sync with those without having this urge of uprooting everything. This is uprooting is a very Marxist sort of tendency that everything is broken, so you further break it apart, shred it into pieces, and only then something new can be reconstructed, as if they have reconstructed anything and proven which has sustained even 20, 30 years. They tried resurrecting USSR. Where is USSR right now? You had one very big nation, very resourceful nation, to actually go out on an experiment and tell us what does the leftist core ideas look like in a manifested form of a nation. What happened to that experiment? It did not last beyond 50 years. Therefore, I am of the view that this mindset, which is actually inculcated in us, that perhaps uprooting everything that we hold so dear is the only way in which you can reform. These are conspiracies against a civilizational state by powers who do not want us to see that we can reform peacefully. And this is where the indoctrination through academics and bunch of the influencers in the left liberal ecosystem who do rotations of professorships in the Western universities are literally inculcated these ideas. They are given a project that perhaps this is the only way in which you can go out and bring reform in this country, and that gets reverberated in classrooms of universities, in several prominent universities as well. And I can echo that. I have been at Harvard, and I can tell you that some of these conversations were pretty extremist, without understanding that society has so many layers which takes generations and generations to coalesce together. Sudden uprootion can only result in chaos, not an organized society. But they haven't gone through those. American society is just 300-400 years old. What do they know about what it means to stay together for several millennia?
Thank you. So, final question from my side. If you are addressing every student in Bharat today, what three values would you ask them to cultivate so that by 2047, India is remembered not only as a developed nation, but also as a civilization that remained rooted in its heritage while leading the world?
Well, that's a pretty difficult question, and I don't find myself that I'm intellectually fit to address all the youth of this country. See, again, there are no universal codes. Okay, that these are the three things that you do, and everything will be in place. Everybody has their own journey. The newer generation do not like role models per se the way we grew up. Every generation have their own approach in grappling with some of these issues that they face. Therefore, I don't want to lecture to the younger minds how do they want to organize themselves. But one thing that I'll say, that your generation or the Gen Z is no different than what we were when we were in our 20s and our late 19s and 18s and those age bracket. We were rebellious. So are you. It is good to be rebellious, which just shows that you've gone through good parenting. Always be inquisitive. Always learn. Read books. Understand what frame of mind did we all had in generations before us. Um, all shades. Don't straight jacket yourself that I'm only willing to read nationalist or a left leaning academician or a reformer or a political leader. Read all things. Make up your own mind. Always be questioning, and I think you will lead to an answer when you do this catharsis in your own mind, when you have this deeply argumentative attitude towards everything. And if you have nation's interest, I think one thing that remains non-negotiable is that something which has been passed on as a baton to the next generation is a preserved, well-thriving society and a nation. Just secure this, and everything under the hood is open for debates and questions.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Rajath, for your inspiring and thought-provoking interaction. So you have reminded us that every generation inherits a nation, but it's through knowledge, character, and service that leaves behind a stronger Bharat for the next generation. Thank you once again.
Dhanyavad. Namaskar. Namaskar to all of you.
Before we conclude, let me invite all our students, parents, and teachers to tomorrow morning's My Bharat, My Responsibility student session. Tomorrow's program begins at 7 a.m., where our young speakers will present on two inspiring themes: The first is the life and legacy of Raja Chikka Venkatappa Nayak, a courageous leader whose contribution deserves greater recognition in our national consciousness. The second theme is My Duty, My Nation. Rights begin with responsibility. It is a timely reminder that a strong nation is built not only by claiming our rights, but also by fulfilling our responsibilities with sincerity and commitment. We warmly invite every student to participate in this unique initiative and become a part of this journey of responsible leadership. So, tomorrow's evening lecture? Yes, it is at 7 p.m. We continue our My Bharat live lecture series with another fascinating and insightful session. We are privileged to welcome Dr. Rita Soni, Associate Professor, Center for the Study of Law and Governance, New Delhi, who will speak on the important theme, Tribal Contributions to India's Independence. So friends, if today's lecture has inspired you, please share with your family, friends, students, and colleagues. This program is available on Disha Bharat Facebook page. Please like, follow, and subscribe to Disha Bharat across Facebook and social media platforms. Let us remember, the deeper our roots, the higher we rise. The better we understand our heritage, the brighter and more secure our future becomes. This is Chetana Rajendra signing off. Jai Hind, Vande Mataram.